Hello. How are you all doing today? Right. Good. Yes, I'm well. Today's one of my favorite topics. So we're looking at machine functionalism, um, the view of the mind that sort of emerged, thanks to, like I've mentioned in previous lectures, Hilary Putnam, who was building on the work of Alan Turing. Of course, as we've kind of seen, um, we've seen a little bit of, but we'll discuss this a little bit further today. Um, this theory of the mental helped to spell the decline of identity theory. All right, we talked about the multiple realizability objection to to identity theory last week. So you're going to want to keep the notion of multiple realizability in mind today because it's going to continue to be a big theme. And I'll remind everybody, of all the important things you'll need to know, what multiple realizability is, etc. I also want to note that I'm doing this lecture a little bit differently than I usually do. Usually I stick quite close to our readings. But today I'm kind of diverging a little bit from what Kim does. We're still going to cover um, pretty much all of the important points about Turing machine functionalism that Kim discusses, but we're going to do it in a less technical way. So we'll be following the same general direction of the chapter, but I'd rather do this the way that I'm used to doing it in other courses. So a lot of what I have today is not just based on Kim, but it's also pulled from the same sorts of ways that I cover this stuff in certain other of my courses. So, my Minds and Machines seminar, well, not really mine. I haven't taught it in years, but Intro to Cognitive Science, I cover a lot of this stuff, right? So, for that reason, I'm not just drawing on Kim's chapter, I'm drawing heavily on Turing, on Putnam's work, his papers, Minds and Machines, and Psychological Predicates, and a little bit of my own PhD research. So I hope that you don't find that too self-indulgent. Hopefully, this way we can get through all those important points and save ourselves some time for some interesting thought experiments. So, machine functionalism. What is machine functionalism? It emerged as the successor to identity theory, and it's thanks largely to this gentleman, Hilary Putnam, a very important figure in 20th century analytic philosophy. And he made contributions, as we'll see later in our textbook, to areas like philosophy of language. He also dabbled in philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of science, and of course, as we'll also see today and further on in the course, particularly the next chapter, this chapter more so, but next chapter on causal theoretical functionalism describes a lot of the outgrowth from the foundation that Putnam helped establish. Obviously, a very big name in philosophy of mind. Um, he's building on the work of Alan Turing, as I've said many, many times. Uh, Turing is important for our purposes because he formalized computation. He gave us a formal sort of description, an abstract description, if you will, of what computation is. What is computation? It's not simply what computers do, right? Computation, as Turing formalized it, is algorithmic or rule governed information processing, taking inputs and transforming those inputs according to a set of instructions into outputs. Um, and Kim doesn't spend a whole lot of time on this, which I find is a little bit interesting. Um, Given that, as I just mentioned, this is kind of like, the foundation that Putnam is working from. It's there, But I would just put a little more emphasis on the fact that what Turing did was not invent the computer. We had computers, um, but he gave us a sort of formalized, logical, or mathematical picture of what computation actually is. And so Turing, I think it's fair to say, especially if you read Computing Machines and Intelligence, Turing believes that minds are computing machines. And Putnam, through his work on machine functionalism, also analogized the mind as a computing machine or an information processing machine. So we'll look at what Turing machines are. Kim does talk about Turing machines at great length. And then we'll talk about the Turing test and then the Chinese room. Um, now, I do hope that you all read Kim's chapter. And of those of you who did, which I hope is all of you, I wonder what you made of what Kim does with Turing machines. Because it is a technical part of the chapter. It's a pretty technical part of the chapter. Nothing, huh? Oh, geez. Well, I guess I'll go first. Even though this is sort of my area of expertise, um, I'm not a mathematically inclined person. So I do actually find, even as someone who teaches this stuff, that as I'm going through this, I have to do it a little bit more slowly than I do with other stuff. But I think that what Kim does is quite helpful in terms of showing us different realizations of Turing machines, showing us the machine tables, the kinds of problems that they can solve. He does a pretty good job um, explaining, for example, the idea of the universal Turing machine. Um, so I guess, well, if no one has any other remarks, we'll carry on. So, um, and here's where we're sort of getting back into the multiple realizability stuff. So let's say the mind is a computing machine, an information processing machine, as functionalism has it, right? How do we understand the mind as the computer? And I should note that I'm drawing here on Jose Luis Bermudez's really great textbook, Cognitive Science, An Introduction to the Science of the Mind. Well, what are the ways we could try and understand the mind as a computer? Well, we could look at the machinery or the hardware. That's one way we could do it. In our case, that would be the brain. Or we could examine the sorts of things that minds as computational systems do. So we could try to understand mentality in terms of mental functions and kind of forget about how it's implemented. So, yeah, approach number one would be like studying the hardware. Like looking at the hardware of my laptop, for example, as opposed to the software, which is the second approach. Um, if we take approach number two, we're taking the functionalist approach. So maybe we could say that the mind brain identity theorists were more amenable to approach number one. We simply look at the brain, maybe we look at behavior, and we simply identify um, our brain states as mental states. So, there's nothing else there is to be in pain other than, say, having C fiber activation. And then depending on your behaviorist inclinations, all the pain behaviors like crying ouch and withdrawing from the painful stimulus and so forth. But if we take approach number two, we're taking a functionalist approach and we're studying the mind as a formal system or an abstract system. And what we're concerned with are the inputs, the outputs, the states between inputs and outputs, the algorithms or the rules which govern the transformation of one state to another. It doesn't really matter to a functionalist um, how this is all implemented. It might matter to some people. It matters to neuroscientists, for example, but for philosophers and for many other kinds of cognitive scientists, the better approach to take is to look at the mind as a computational system, a formal system for information processing. And all of this is due in very large part to functionalism and the notion of multiple realizability. So, in terms of functionalism, let's unpack that a bit. As I said earlier, here, when I say we're studying the mind as a formal or functional system, we're studying it in a sort of abstract way. So, what we're really interested in are the functional or the logical relations between mental states or between sensory inputs, mental states, and behavioral outputs, right? And we do that by analogizing the mind with a type of computer called a Turing machine. We're not really concerned about how it's implemented. So we're trying to understand the mind in terms of what it does and how it does it, and we're not really concerned about the hardware, right? We're more interested in the functionality of the software. And we've gone through a few different examples, but one that Bermudez uses in his textbook is the example of a heart. The heart is like a natural machine. It's not a thinking machine. It's a blood pumping machine, right? If you're a functionalist, what is it that makes something a heart? Is it, for example, what the heart is made of? You know, our hearts are made of muscle fibers, special muscle fibers, in fact, cardiac muscle fibers, and some nerve cells. So we've got neurons, we've got different nodes, and electric signals pass through those nodes so that the heart beats the way it's supposed to beat. Um, is that what makes something a heart? Is it how many chambers it has? Is it the heart's size? Well, not if you're a functionalist, right? If you're a functionalist, what essentially makes something a heart is its function. Um, what makes something a heart is the fact that a heart is an organ that pumps deoxygenated blood to your lungs so that it can get reoxygenated, and then it pumps that oxygenated blood throughout the body to oxygenate all your cells, and then the the deoxygenated blood gets pumped back to the heart so that it can go back to the lungs, right? So what makes something a heart is a heart. It has nothing to do with its physical structure. It has nothing to do with what a heart is made out of, how many chambers it has, how big or small it is. What matters is the function that it fulfills. So if you're a functionalist, all of these count as hearts, right? A blue whale's heart is the largest heart that has ever existed on the planet Earth. It's so big, you know those cool Volkswagen vans? It's bigger than one of those, right? So imagine, you know, people go camping in those Volkswagen vans. Um, a blue whale's heart is so big that you could, well, were it not functioning as a heart, you could camp out in it. Um, Fish hearts, reptile hearts, they have different numbers of chambers compared to human hearts. And they pump blood. Well, in the case of fish, they pump deoxygenated blood to gills rather than lungs, right? But that doesn't matter. The function is to move around that oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, even though fish have, I think, two or three chambers, depending on the species of fish, right? So that doesn't matter. What makes a heart is what it's doing. Or even at the top here, if I had like an artificial implant that pumped my blood in place of my heart, right? Like Captain Jean-Luc Picard from Star Trek: The Next Generation. He has an artificial heart. Um, and that's a heart, even though it's made of some kind of futuristic sci-fi technology, it functions the same as a quote unquote biological heart. Well, no, I wouldn't say when it stops beating, it no longer counts as a heart. It's still a heart, but it's a heart that's not functioning properly, right? Like last summer, for example, my father got a pacemaker. Um, So not like Captain Picard, not a completely artificial heart, but the reason why, I don't want to overshare here, but the reason has to do with the signals going from the various nodes of the heart. Some of his signals were not getting through to where they needed to go. So a pacemaker fills the role that those different nodes used to fill. That's still a heart, even though it wasn't ticking properly, right? Um, so even if the heart stops beating, it's a heart by virtue of its function, a function that it would fulfill were it working properly, right? Is a dialysis machine a kidney? In a way, it's like a big giant external kidney, I guess you could say. Um, if imagine we could shrink a dialysis machine down and put it in a kidney shaped container and replace a kidney with it, then we could say it's an artificial kidney potentially. But the point is, all of this is to illustrate that what matters to the functionalist is the function, right? Likewise, think back to our calculator example. Who remembers the calculator example? What were all the different kinds of calculators that we came up with the other day? Yeah, fingers, Texas Instruments calculator, a phone calculator, an abacus. So we've got hardware calculators, software calculators, analog calculators. Well, no, I guess abacuses are not actually analog. Um, our hands, right? All ways, all different sorts of calculators. What makes them calculators is the fact that they calculate, right? We can do arithmetic with them. Doesn't matter what it's made of. Could be just ones and zeros in a phone. It could be, a little circuit board on your little pocket calculator. Could be an abacus with those beads on those wires that you move back and forth, right? Doesn't matter. They're all calculators by virtue of the fact that they calculate. So we say that a heart or a calculator or a mind can be implemented or realized by different kinds of physical structures. And this is multiple realizability. Now, another interesting digression. Um, if cognitive systems, that is minds, are multiply realizable in the same way that, say, calculators are, then it might be a mistake to focus on the brain. We might then take as essential to certain cognitive processes various brain structures, which are just the way they are because of evolution. In other words, there are different ways to realize minds besides just the human brain. So this is why ultimately machine functionalism spelled the end of identity theory. And we got hints of this previously too, right? What about our octopus friends who we all agreed likely experience pain? But octopus have very, very different nervous systems than we do. Maybe they don't even have, just for argument's sake, I don't know what octopuses really have, but where we have C fibers that activate when we suffer tissue damage, maybe octopus have O fibers, right? Now, on identity theory, on type physicalism, to be in pain is to have your C fibers firing. So this seems to rule out the possibility of creatures with different physiologies experiencing pain. But I think we agree that that's somewhat absurd. Um, so, um, no problem if you're a functionalist, because there's more than one way to realize pain. We realize pain via C fiber activation. Octopus might realize it via O fiber activation. Maybe there are aliens on the planet Zorp who experience pain when their flarb matrices vibrate. I don't know, right? Like, all of these are different ways of implementing or realizing pain, different ways of matching those inputs to outputs, right? Tissue damage, sensation of pain, pain behavior. You can do that with C fibers, with O fibers, or with whatever I called those alien parts earlier. I don't remember. Flarb matrices. I just made that up. That's not a real thing. Okay, any questions about why? Um, just to make sure that we're clear on why multiple realizability is such a problem for the identity theorist. Okay, another thing that I decided to pull from Bermudez today because I think it's interesting is that in an ironic sort of twist, since the cognitive revolution, some of the things that we have come to learn about the brain actually support a type of functionalism. And I'd like to unpack that a little bit. One is neuroplasticity. So, who's familiar with this idea of neuroplasticity? And if you're familiar, can you explain the concept to the class? Basically, Shannon, the brain can rewire itself, can create new pathways, specifically after some kind of traumatic injury, right? Um, so this could be, um, or yeah, just when you're growing as a kid. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So, uh, neuroplasticity. Say I suffer from a head injury or a stroke, I might acquire brain damage, and that might result in a loss of function or a change of change of function. But the brain is very plastic, and the brain can actually form new neural connections. And I might, with the right kinds of support and therapy, I might actually regain some or all of the functionality that I lost due to my injury. Or Shannon, like you say, with children, children as they grow up actually have they develop lots and lots of neural connections, way more than they'll ever need. And then I believe starting from our teenage years up until we're in our mid 20s, um, there's a process called neural pruning where many of those extra connections that aren't being used are actually pruned away. That's like a kind of neuroplasticity. Or even if you just think in terms of Hebbian learning, right? Named after the neuroscientist Donald Hebb from McGill University. Hebbian learning. Who wants to tell me about Hebbian learning? It's simple because there's a little rhyme that helps you remember. Hebbian learning, anybody? All right. Well, okay, Pearl, you got it. I was just about to say, but Pearl got it. Neurons that fire together wire together. Yes. And additionally, neurons that fire apart wire apart. Um, so neurons that talk to one another, the strength of their connections increases. And that's called Hebbian learning. So as neurons communicate with one another, um, the greater the number of signals or intensity of signals between neurons, the stronger the connections get. Animal minds, another one. We've seen this already. I think we all agree that humans and non-human animals can um, can do things like feel pain. Um, Certain non-human animals can reason. So a lot of animals can reason in basic ways, but certain animals can reason in highly complex ways. Today, I watched my dog, for example. Uh, my partner made a tuna sandwich and just gave her the can of tuna to eat the little bits of tuna. So I observed my dog pick up the can from the kitchen where the surface on the floor is slippery, bring it to the living room on the carpet, put it down, hold the can in place with one of her paws, and then eat the delicious tuna. I mean, I know she's just a dog, and she's my dog, so obviously I think she's awesome. But that's quite clever. Um, Now, obviously, our brains are different. Perhaps if I needed to work out how to lick the contents out of a can of tuna, I might come up with a similar solution. If that is, I had paws instead of hands. Um, but our brains are quite different. Yet, my dog seems capable of reasoning out a pretty good way of getting those bits of tuna fish out of the can without it sliding on the floor, right? Neural reuse is another interesting factoid about the brain that's sort of come to light within the last couple of decades. There are some areas of the brain which we used to think were very highly specialized, but it turns out they're actually used in lots of different cognitive tasks. And I'll give you one example, the fusiform face area. So, this is an area of the brain, it's in your fusiform gyrus. And this area shows a lot of activation when we show people images of faces, of human faces. So it was reasoned that this is like a face area. This is an area that we use to detect faces. And there's actually a neurological disorder called prosopagnosia. People with prosopagnosia have damage to the fusiform face area such that they can't recognize faces. But here's the thing. It turns out that the fusiform face area is not just used for human faces, rather, it's used for all kinds of pattern recognition, particularly when one is an expert in recognizing those particular patterns. Um, just to give you an example, it's been found that expert chess players, when looking at legal versus illegal chessboard configurations, will see a high level of activity in their fusiform gyrus. So it's not that the fusiform face area is specifically for facial recognition. It's actually for visual, kind of like expert level visual recognition. And most of us, if we don't have prosopagnosia, um, tend to just be experts at recognizing other faces. And there are interesting cases of prosopagnosia where, for example, an expert in some field loses that expertise. When I taught a neuroscience class, I would share a few examples of this with my students. One was a farmer with prosopagnosia who could no longer recognize his cows. Another was an ornithologist who, after suffering, I think it was a stroke, um, was no longer able to recognize different bird species. So very interesting. Yeah. I mean, he could read the numbers on their, you know how cows have those ear tags and they all have like a number so we can identify them. He could still read the numbers, but he could no longer go just off of their faces, right? Yeah, it's pattern. It's a type of pattern recognition. So fusiform face area is really like expert pattern recognition, not simply faces. And we find that the fusiform face area is active across lots of different individuals with expertise in different areas. Very interesting. So these are all interesting facts about the brain um, that show that certain cognitive functions are multiply realizable in different sorts of brain structures, whether it's my brain versus your brain, an injured brain that's rewired itself versus a healthy brain, or a non-human animal brain, or even within my own brain, like my fusiform gyrus. I use it for recognizing faces. I'm sure I use it for recognizing other important patterns. Um, I don't know, guitar chords, right? Like I play the guitar, and if I look at those chord frame diagrams, I'd be willing to bet that my fusiform gyrus is uh, playing an active role in that sort of pattern recognition. So let's call that idea weak functionalism, and we'll call the idea that the physical realization doesn't matter at all strong functionalism. Again, this is not something we get in Kim's chapter. It's something that I'm doing following Bermudez. Um, so if functionalism is true, and there are lots of different ways to implement a mind, if multiple realizability really is a thing, then what about machines? Can they be said to have minds? Can machines be said to think? And this is where we get to I guess, some of the interesting antecedents of functionalism. And this goes back farther than you think. Aristotle, for example, in Book 2, Chapter 1 of De Anima, or On the Soul, wrote that, but since it is also a body of such and such a kind, living body, having life, namely having life, the body cannot be soul. The body is the subject or matter, not what is attributed to it. Hence, the soul must be a substance in the sense of the form of a natural body having life, potentially, that should really say potentiality within it. But substance is actuality, and thus soul is the actuality of a body as above characterized. So we can say, following Aristotle, that the soul is the form of a living body. And what he means by that is its structure, its functions, how it is organized. Um, After all, it is in virtue of this organization that the body is alive. And Aristotle, and think all the way back to the beginning of the class, also believed that there were three, uh, we could say, kinds of soul or aspects to soul or parts of soul. There was the vegetative soul or the nutritive soul. All living things have this. Plants, fungi, although Aristotle didn't distinguish between plants and fungus, um, animals, and humans all have a nutritive soul, which allows creatures to grow, reproduce, consume food, etc. Animals, but not plants, also have a sensitive soul. And the sensitive soul is the organizing principle for bodies that can sense their environment and move around in it and interact with the environment. And then humans are special for Aristotle because humans have a rational soul. So there's something about our bodies that are so organized such that we have reason. And remember also, Aristotle didn't think it was the brain. He wasn't sure where, how it all worked. But the brain, he conjectured, might have been like a cooling device of some kind, rather than a thinking device. Here's another interesting anticipation of functionalism from Thomas Hobbes. In Leviathan, he starts off um, thusly. He says, Nature, the art whereby God hath made and governs the world, is by the art of man, as in many other things, so in this also imitated, that it can make an artificial animal. Foreseeing that life is but a motion of limbs, the beginning whereof is in some principal part within, why may we not say that all automata, engines that move themselves by springs and wheels, as doth a watch, have an artificial life? Very functionalist. Now, um, Hobbes was a contemporary of Descartes. In fact, the two, if I'm not mistaken, the two corresponded with one another. Um, Hobbes was living in France for a good bit of his life, in fact, because he was a royalist during the English Civil War. So he was living in exile. And his book Leviathan is actually um, ultimately a book on how to govern. Um, but because what he does is analogize the state with a giant artificial person, he has to first explain people, which he explains as machines, natural machines. But where Descartes thought that the body was a machine and the mind a thinking substance, Hobbes says we're all machine. In chapter 5 of book 1 of Leviathan, he says, for reason is nothing but reckoning, that is, adding and subtracting, of consequences of general names agreed upon, for the marking and signifying of our thoughts. I say marking them when we reckon by ourselves, and signifying when we demonstrate or approve our reckonings to other men. So think of something very simple, like a deductive syllogism. We have a structure there, a form, a formal structure to a deductive syllogism. Premise one, premise two, conclusion. Um, let's go with the classic, right? All men are mortal. That's premise one. Premise two, Socrates is a man. What is the conclusion? Someone tell me in the chat. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's right. That's right. Great. Great job. Now, what Hobbes is saying here is when we think in this way, what we're doing is like reckoning or calculation, but we're doing it with words and concepts, not merely numbers. So we all know who Socrates is. We know what men are. We know what mortality is. Um, and so we can sort of calculate, if you like, we can reckon, that is, calculate that Socrates is immortal uh, based on those two premises. All men are mortal and Socrates is a man. And Hobbes thinks that all thinking is like this, but we're doing it with, well, what we would call concepts, which we mark with words, like when we reckon by ourselves. We can also signify, like if I say, "Oh, there's Socrates over there," I'm signifying that Socrates. But you see the idea, right? I also think, even though sometimes he's discussed as an epiphenomenalist, I think Julien Offray de la Mettrie, who was a French physician and philosopher from the 18th century, sounds quite a lot like a functionalist. And his book, L'Homme Machine, or Man a Machine, is very interesting. It's kind of like a polemic, almost like a rant. Not quite a rant, but it's meant to be provocative. And it's sort of a polemic against Cartesian immaterialism. Lemaitre wrote that man's preeminent advantage is his organism. We, like animals, are all natural machines. Um, and we might be superior to animals in the sense that we've got a better machine for thinking or for making tools or using language. But there are plenty of animals that are superior to us in many ways. Lots of animals are stronger or faster, right, by virtue of their organism. And we all of us, so this is another area of departure from Descartes for Lemaitre. All of us, humans and animals both, have a soul. It's just not an immaterial soul. The soul is just the part of a living machine that thinks. One really interesting, just to demonstrate this, like, if one of the examples that Lemaitre uses, right? If a child is lost somewhere, it'll just cry until its parents come and find it. But if a dog gets lost, it can use its nose to find his human. Um, so even though dogs aren't as smart as us, they still have a pretty good organism in terms of smelling, right? Um, I think he says something like the following at some point in Man and Machine. What animal would die, or what something like what kind of animal's offspring would die in a river of milk? Man alone, right? You could have a baby in a river of milk, and it wouldn't figure out um, that it can drink the milk, um, because humans have such a long developmental pathway, but we have things like education and stuff, so that we can use our thinking machinery to the best of our ability. So those are some interesting forerunners of Turing and Putnam that I like to cover in my Minds and Machines seminar, which is a first year seminar that looks at um, kind of how we went from looking at the mind as the soul to the mind as a thinking machine. But talking about thinking machines, what do we mean when we talk about functionalism? What do we mean? Well, as Kim says, functional systems are formal systems or abstract systems. We're talking things like Turing machines, which we'll look at later, but also like logical calculus. Um, all these systems are sound and complete, and they contain symbols which have meanings. Think of logical calculus, right? There are different systems. Predicate calculus is one. We're actually going to get into some of this next time. Um, but within formal logic, there are lots of symbols that we can use to create expressions which state things, and then we can derive proofs. We can reason our way through things. Um, Now, these symbols are arbitrary. The symbols are just physical patterns. They can be whatever we want them to be, and they can mean whatever we want them to mean. Um, in fact, that's what's important is what the symbols mean. Um, what each symbols mean, which is arbitrary but is important once you assign meaning to the symbols, together with how each symbol is related to all of the other symbols in the system. That is the syntax. These are what are important. This is how meaning is preserved in these systems. Um, we could describe a Turing machine then in a couple of different ways. It's a functional system. It's got different states that it can be in, and those states are sort of defined by their functional roles. We could call those logical or functional states, but we could also physically realize a Turing machine if we wanted to. So it could have different physical states. And we can do the same thing with human minds. Now I'm drawing from Putnam's paper, Minds and Machines. Human mental states might correspond to the logical states of a Turing machine, and the physiological states of the brain correspond to the physical states of the Turing machine. But you might be wondering, well, what the heck is a Turing machine anyway? Well, I'll tell you. Turing machines were conceptualized by Alan Turing, pictured here. Alan Turing was a very bright young man who got a bachelor's degree at Cambridge, and went on to graduate school at Princeton. And he published a very influential paper called On Computable Numbers. And here is where he outlines what we now call the notion of the Turing machine. Some interesting facts about Turing. I mean, he was a hugely important figure, and also met quite a tragic end. So, after his publication of some years after his publication of On Computable Numbers, Turing ended up working at Bletchley Park during the Second World War. This was part of Project Ultra. So Project Ultra was basically um, the UK's I don't not strictly speaking espionage, but say cryptography division. They would try to figure out what the Nazis were up to, and then share that information with the Allies. And Turing was a cryptographer there. There were all kinds of people who were hired as cryptographers at Bletchley Park. There were other mathematicians. There were crossword puzzle enthusiasts, chess players, right? All kinds of people, whoever they thought could help decrypt these messages that the Germans were sending via their Enigma machines, would have been working at Bletchley Park. By the way, these Enigma machines, they were a challenge to decrypt. Actually, can anyone know? We got any history people here who know a little about this stuff, who want to jump in and nerd out a little bit? Adrian, go ahead.
Uh, so basically, it was a scrambler, which would turn one letter. So let's say you put an A, it would scramble it to an X, and that's easy to decrypt. But it would scramble it 4 different times, 3 to 4 different times,
Yeah,
and then every time you scrambled it, it would change the key
yeah.
so that even so A could be X at one point, and then it'll be F at the next point.
Hmm.
And there's no way there was no physical. You needed the actual name machine in
Yeah.
order to decrypt it.
Yeah. And so you're right. These it would scramble because the machine had these rotors and they could be set in something like 150 million different ways. And they were changed every week too. So there's no way they could have brute forced that. So what Turing did, because he had plans for the Enigma machine, which Polish soldiers and spies had smuggled out of Poland as the Soviets and the Germans were invading Poland. And they had, I think, also found a couple of Enigma machines. And thanks to this, Turing was able to build computers, which were called bombs, BOMBEs, which could work out the settings on the machines. So the computers that Turing designed at Bletchley Park weren't decoding the messages so much as they were working out how the Enigma machines must have been set, and that allowed the Allies to read the messages that the Nazis were sending. And this was so secretive that the extent of his contributions to the war effort were not known until well after his death. Um, Later, in 1950, and this is the paper that I made available as a supplementary reading, Turing poses the question: Can a machine think? Which is what we're interested in, right? And this is where we get the imitation game, or what we now know as the Turing test. Just a few years after the publication of that paper, Turing was charged and convicted of gross indecency. This was a crime in the United Kingdom at the time. Um, well, gross indecency was how homosexuality was criminalized in the UK. You see, Alan Turing was a gay man at a time when, I mean, it's not so much that that it was a weird time where people knew that gay people existed, right? Um, and certain people were happy to live and let live, and certain people were a little more bigoted about it, right? But one of the worries um, in Second World War through the Cold War was blackmail. Um, if you were a closeted homosexual, you could be blackmailed into giving away secrets. Um, that's not what happened to Turing. Turing was charged with gross indecency, the same charge that was brought against Oscar Wilde, actually, because it was discovered that he had been in a relationship with this guy named Arnold Murray after he burgled Turing's house. Um, and he was given the choice between, like, he was found guilty, and he was given the choice between going to prison or basically chemical castration via this artificial estrogen. And he chose chemical castration. Um, not a great choice. Not a great choice to be given. Turing underwent mental and physical changes as a result of this procedure, right? Like he developed breast tissue, personality changes, and in 1954, he was found dead in his home, um, apparently having committed suicide, but we're not sure. It's plausible that he might have committed suicide. He might have taken his own life by eating an apple that had been laced with cyanide. It's also possible that he just was accidentally poisoned because he did have a laboratory at home, and he did have chemicals like hydrogen cyanide in his laboratory. So it could have been accidental exposure. It could have been suicide. We really don't know. But in 2014, Turing was posthumously pardoned by Queen Elizabeth II. And now the Alan Turing Law has been on the books in England and Wales since 2016, and it retroactively pardons men who were convicted basically for just being gay, as Turing was. So immensely tragic, um, especially given that beyond, I think, everybody's right to be who they are. I mean, it was an incredibly unjust thing to happen to Turing and to other people like Turing. Um, but also, some historians estimate that Turing's work with his colleagues on Project Ultra might have shortened the war by up to 2 years, the war in Europe by up to 2 years, and that his work might have saved about 15 million lives. Um, I mean, that is incredible. Um, so I just think it's doubly tragic what happened to Turing. I mean, a brilliant guy who formalizes the notion of computation, makes all these contributions to the war effort, possibly even shortening the war and saving millions of lives, thanks to the work of he and his colleagues. But also just just to be criminalized for who you are. Even if that's why it's doubly unjust, right? So Turing is like like I don't have heroes. I don't have favorite philosophers. But Turing is somebody whose work and life I really respect, and whose contributions have been enormous, and whose life circumstances were very tragic. So, well, why are we talking about Turing today? Well, as I said, he formalizes the notion of computation. Um, he borrows the idea of the algorithm to do this. The notion of the algorithm had been around for quite a long time. Actually, I know we have some people in the class who can tell me who came up with algorithms. Really old. Back in the day, I believe at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age. Anybody know? As a mathematician, I believe his name was Al-Khwarizmi, and he thought that, what if we just came up with these sorts of step-by-step procedures for solving mathematical problems? And that notion has come to be Latinized as the algorithm. So an algorithm is a set of rules, as I say down here in this point, the third point down. Um, an algorithm is an unambiguous set of rules that can be applied to an object or set of objects to transform it in a definite and circumscribed way. Turing borrows this idea and comes up with a Turing machine, which is like an imaginary machine. Um, He does this as part of his efforts to address the halting problem. So the halting problem is like a sort of decision problem. The halting problem is specifically concerned with whether there's a procedure for determining whether a given mathematical problem has a solution. Um, if you had a computer doing a math problem, you want to know, is the problem computable? Or will the computer just keep on going forever and never find a problem, never find a solution? So Turing thinks of computation as a mechanical procedure, and he conceives of Turing machines as like an imaginary mechanism. It's interesting to note that before the notion of digital computers really became widespread, computer was actually a job description, right? So human computers, um, the computers at Bletchley Park, for example, yes, there was the bomb, there were those computers, but most of the computers at Bletchley Park were actually people who were doing calculations. And they had a set of instructions, like a program, and they were not allowed to deviate from the program. Um, so um, Imagine there's a machine that does this, and it does not deviate from the program. We give it a program, a set of instructions, a set of algorithms to transform some inputs into outputs in a definite, circumscribed way. Um, that's computation. Computation is a sort of mechanical, discrete, sort of step by step, rule governed transformation of inputs to outputs. And Kim doesn't really talk about this. Kim just kind of goes right into Turing machines. Now, Turing machines are imaginary. I cannot stress this enough. They are imaginary. If we made one, maybe we'd make one that looks like this. Or we could make a virtual one out of software, as Kim suggests. Maybe somebody who's really dedicated could maybe make one out of like valves and tubes, and it could be powered by water, although that would take a long time to process anything. But Turing machines are imaginary or abstract. They have an infinitely long tape, and on the tape are cells. Then there's a machine head. It can move the tape to the left or the right. It can delete cells, so delete symbols in the cells and write new ones, etc. We've got our window to see the state of the machine, and we have a machine table which contains instructions, or if you like, all of the states that the machine can be in. We'd call this the program today. So that's what a Turing machine is. Very important to note that Turing never actually built a Turing machine. Um, Rather, he uses them as imaginary tools to try and formalize, or not try, he did, to successfully formalize the notion of computation as algorithmic information processing. Here are some other important things about Turing machines. Their behavior is determined by the machine's current state, what's in the machine table, and the symbols on the tape. Now, these machines gave Turing a mechanistic account of algorithmic information processing. So now he could address the halting problem, which incidentally he showed has no solution. Turing also described Turing machines as discrete state machines. They can only be in one state at a time. There might be many possible states that a Turing machine could be in, but it can only be in one state at a time. It might iterate through states very, very quickly, but it can still only be in one state at a time. And because of these machines were imaginary mathematical sorts of machines, he could represent them as sequences of numbers and derive mathematical proofs about Turing machines. So, probably the most important for our purposes is that there exists a special kind of Turing machine that can implement any special, specific kind of Turing machine. These are the theoretical precursors to the computers that we all use today. In computing machinery intelligence, he calls them digital computers or universal computers, but they are universal Turing machines. As I said, we've had computers before Turing came along. Um, I think in this very chapter, Kim mentions Charles Babbage's analytical engine. So Charles Babbage was the Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge in the 19th century. That's the same position that was held by Isaac Newton and more recently by Stephen Hawking. And Charles Babbage conceived of a couple of computers. One was the difference engine, and the other was the analytical engine, which, although it operated mechanically with wheels and gears and so forth, it was a digital computer. Babbage never finished building it, but later in the 20th century, some engineers got together and built a version of it based on Babbage's designs, and it worked. Another interesting thing is that even though he never completed the machine, his friend Ada Lovelace wrote the first program for it. So for that reason, Ada Lovelace is widely regarded as the first computer programmer. But there are other computers that go even further back in time. I mean, Google the Antikythera mechanism, for example. That's an ancient Greek computer that was used for reckoning time, calculating the positions of stars and planets for navigation. That thing is like 2,000 years old. And it wasn't the first one. It's the first one we know of, but we know from the complexity of its design that it probably wasn't the first one. So computers have been around for a long time, but it was Turing who gave us this sort of mathematical formalized notion of what computation is. So Turing did not build the Turing machine. He used it again to formalize computation, to explain to us in a rigorous, systematic way, like this is what a computer is, right? He also proved that there's no solution to the halting problem. And he articulated something that we now call the Church-Turing thesis after Turing and his doctoral supervisor, Alonzo Church, at Princeton. Um, so there's no solution to the halting problem. The halting problem is not decidable. You can't. There's no computational procedure for working out whether a mathematical problem has a solution or whether your computer will just continue on forever trying to find a solution that isn't there. But Turing, and this is the important stuff. This is the Church-Turing thesis. He and the work of Alonzo Church showed that any mathematical problem that is decidable, that can be solved algorithmically or computationally, can be solved by a Turing machine. So anything that we can express algorithmically is decidable or computable. And because of this, um, we had a basis for understanding, as Putnam would later go on to do, understanding cognition as information processing, as computation. That is, as transforming representations according to rules. Okay, I wonder if we should have a quick break. Okay, Brendan says thumbs up. I agree, thumbs up. I have 3:38 on the oven clock. Uh, let's go at 3:40 and then make it an even 15 minutes. So, any questions so far? Because I've thrown a heck of a lot at you, and Kim's chapter throws a heck of a lot at you. I just want to make sure that well, you know what? You know what we can do? I want you guys to think about any questions you might have concerning Turing machines, concerning computation, concerning multiple realizability. Any questions like that. And then when we return from the break, which will be in 15 minutes, um, I will answer those questions before we go on to talk about Putnam stuff. Does that sound good? All right. Okay. Well, it's about to be 3:40 on my little clock on my oven. So let's take a 15-minute break. I'll see you all shortly. Okay, everybody, back from our brain break. Um, so, were there any questions about anything I've said about Turing machines before we get to the remainder of the material for today? And I'll ask again, I mean, what did you make of Kim's discussion of Turing machines? Because I do think that his little examples are quite helpful, right? Where he illustrates the machine tables for us and the problems that they're solving, right? Like adding, I think it's like he gives us a couple of different Turing machines with different procedures for adding 2 plus 3, right? And you can see how the machine head moves the tape and deletes and writes new symbols on the tape to solve the problem. And it does so by following the instructions in the machine table. Because it is, I ask because it is technical stuff. So just before we move on, I want to make sure that we're all good. Okay, well, I guess we'll carry on then. Um, so what Putnam does is use the notion of a Turing machine to argue that minds are functional systems. And remember, the realization of a functional system isn't what makes it the system that it is, it's the function. So, what matters are functional relations between the states that the system can be in, not what it's made of, like with the calculator example. And in his work, Putnam uses the C fiber example to illustrate, um, uh, similar to the identity theorists, right? Uh, uh, so in minds and machines, and I think in psychological predicates too, um, Putnam looks at statements like, for example, a statement such as Josh is in pain and Josh's C fibers are firing. Are these statements saying the same thing or something different? Well, if you're an identity theorist, these mean the same thing. What about if you're a functionalist? Well, what matters if you're a functionalist are the logical relations between, or the formal relations between the logical states. It's not really so important how things are realized physically. So maybe we have some aliens, as I've said earlier, with a very different sort of physiology from humans, and they don't have C fibers. Would we deny that they could experience pain on that basis? Well, no, I don't think we would. I think we would just say, on the multiple realizability thesis, that C fiber activation is one way to physically realize the state of being in pain, and there may be other ways of realizing uh, the state of being in pain. And what Putnam is doing here, again, is criticizing identity theory or type physicalism. So remember, on type physicalism, mental states are a type of brain state. So being in pain is just a matter of being in a certain type of brain state, namely where your C fibers are firing. And we can contrast this with the token identity theory that we talked briefly about last time. So my mental state of being in pain is a token of a type of mental state. So here we're talking specific mental states that are realized by specific brain events, not by types of brain events. Now, functionalism and multiple realizability help us to avoid some of the problems with type physicalism, right? After all, there might not be steady categories of brain states. All of our brains are wired up a little bit differently. To say nothing of the brains of non-human animals or artificial brains or alien brains, right? So um, all this is to say, um, uh, Well, you can see why I think Putnam's contributions following Turing's sort of spelled the decline of identity theory. And as we focused on last week, a lot of that has got to do with multiple realizability. Now it's time to start doing some thought experiments. So, one last time, I just want to make sure everybody is good with Turing machines, with machine functionalism, multiple realizability, etc. Okay, that's the last time. I'll check. So we carry on with the imitation game. Now, even though Turing's work served as the foundation for Putnam's functionalism, Turing has a different approach when it comes to ascertaining whether a machine could be said to think. I mean, Putnam's functionalism and the view of the mind that's kind of evolved out of that, which is the computational representational theory of mind, just says that, yeah, like minds are computing machines, minds are like computers. So, of course, machines can think because the mind is a sort of natural thinking machine. Turing has a different way of answering the question, can machines think? And his means of answering this question involves with replacing the question with something else, which we now call the imitation game. In fact, he thought this question, can machines think, was too meaningless to deserve discussion. Why? Well, we'd be arguing ad infinitum about what machine means, what thinking is, etc. So why don't we replace this question with an operationalist test of intelligence? And that's what the imitation game, or what we now call the Turing test, is. So what is operationalism? What is it to have an operationalist test of intelligence? Well, operationalism is when we try to take something unmeasurable or unobservable, I mean, directly, not directly measurable or directly observable, such as thinking, and make it measurable by focusing on something that we can observe. The behaviorists did this, right? They operationalized mentality as behavior. We can't observe mentality directly. So we'll just look at behavior, right? Turing is doing something similar here. He's operationalizing thinking as verbal behavior specifically. So here, we want to measure intelligence, but we cannot directly measure intelligence or thinking. What would that even mean? So we do something else. We look at something that we can observe, which we all agree that intelligent creatures can do, and that is verbal behavior, specifically having a conversation. And so the imitation game, or the Turing test, is an operationalist test of intelligence as verbal behavior that looks at whether somebody, like a person, can distinguish between a human and a machine just based on their verbal behavior, based on the conversations they have with it. That's what the Turing test is ultimately about. And in the original formulation that Turing gives us in Computing, Machinery, and Intelligence, we have a three-player game. We have a man, a woman, and then we have an interrogator. The interrogator could be of any gender. And we'll call them A, B, and C respectively. So A is the man, B is the woman, C is the interrogator. Now C has to ask A and B questions. And C is trying to identify who is the man and who is the woman. But C can't hear A or B. C asks questions and gets their answers via teletype written messages. Now, A, the man, is trying to be deceptive. He's trying to fool C into making the wrong guess. So he might give C misleading answers. B wants C to make the right guess, so she gives truthful answers. And then Turing says, okay, so what happens if a machine takes the place of a man, of the man in this game? Would the interrogator know that they were talking to a computer? Or might they identify A as a human man or a woman? If um, the machine convincingly appears as a man uh, to the interrogator, then the test is passed. Later on, Turing would simplify the game. We would get um, a two-player version, basically. Um, One player we'll call player one, could be a human or a machine, and the second player is the interrogator. The interrogator asks questions of player one in a viva voce style of examination in living voice via teletype. So you're typing in all sorts of different questions, and the idea is that you're supposed to use the basis of player two's answers to try and guess whether, um, or the second player is trying to use player one's answers to try and guess whether they're talking to a human or a machine. If they can't tell, then the test is passed. So, say player one is a machine. If after 5 minutes of questioning, I can't tell, like, a human or machine, I don't know. Oh, it's really convincingly human, but I guess it could be a machine. Then the test is passed. And we have to grant that whatever the machine is doing, it's justifiably regarded as thinking because it's doing something that we all agree thinking things can do, and that is it is holding an intelligent conversation. And it's this later version that we usually think of when we talk about um, the Turing test nowadays. I like that Turing does it this way, right? This viva voce sort of examination. This is what you do, for example, in like a thesis defense, which some of you may go on to do, right? If you go to graduate school, you may have to write a thesis and then you have to defend it in front of a committee, which will consist of your supervisor or co supervisors, your internal, external examiner, and there'll be also like a I forget what they're called, but the chair of the thesis committee who kind of moderates the discussion, right? And these really smart people ask you questions about the work you've done to make sure that you really understand what you claim to understand in your work. This is a living voice sort of examination. In fact, in the United Kingdom, right, if you're going to Cambridge or Oxford and you're doing a thesis defense, it's not called a thesis defense. It's called a viva, short for viva voce in living voice. It's also a kind of party game that people used to play. It's similar to that game where, I don't know, you get a card and you stick it up here and it says the identity of someone on the card and you can't see it, but everyone else can. And you have to ask questions like, okay, am I a man or a woman? Am I a historical figure? Am I a celebrity? What am I, right? And you have to ask questions and guess who you are. It's similar to that. So that's the kind of thing Turing imagines us doing with a machine to see if we can distinguish whether we're talking to a human person or a machine. Now, there's a few different ways you can understand the Turing test. Um, One is as a thought experiment, and I think this is actually one of the better ways to use the test. So, what are thought experiments? Well, thought experiments are imaginary exercises directed toward, some scenario, and we do them to help delineate our intuitions about something or our beliefs about something. And in some places, in uh, computing machinery and intelligence, and in other interviews and publications, Turing discusses his test as if it's a thought experiment. For example, he asks in computing machinery intelligence, he asks whether there are imaginable digital computers which would do well in the imitation game. So, is it conceivable that a digital computer suitably programmed could convince somebody that it's a person, not a computer? And you can do that experiment yourself. right? Um, I mean, let's do it right now. Do you think, and maybe your answers will be different from previous courses now that large language models are a thing, but do you think it's possible that we could construct a machine that you could talk to in this sort of like viva voce teletype written exchange um, that could convince you that it's a human, even if it's a machine, based on its verbal behavior? And I'm really curious about your answers, given that we are in this age of generative AI with large language models. Um, it's probably conceivable to a lot of you because there are um, large language models that can speak quite convincingly like a human. Grant says, "Yeah, lol, yeah, of course." It's interesting because Uh, I like I taught this material before the proliferation of large language models, and there would be some disagreement. But I don't know. Maybe some people do disagree. Like I find that there is a certain sort of voice that these large language models have. So when people use them to generate content on social media, or when they use them to write an essay or answer quiz questions, there are little tells that I've learned to spot. Is this regardless of questions asked? We will get to that actually, because there are some questions that will give the machine away as a machine. And Turing says we have to account for that. Yeah, Grant, maybe it is dependent on how long you talk to it for. Yeah. Timothy, what do you think?
I think if someone is just using a basic like one or two line prompt, I can tell.
Hmm.
But I've learned in some of like my instructional university lectures, like for like a seminar, or I don't know what it's called, but it's like a non-credited course, but they teach you about AI.
Hmm.
And that some people can get very detailed with their prompts,
Yes.
and AI can generate much better responses. So I wouldn't say I am 100% confident that I can
Yeah.
discern it. But maybe like I remember you said you are somewhat of an expert on machine learning. Maybe you would be able to discern it. Like depends on the
It,
person.
I mean, yeah, uh, I, you get a bit of expertise, but it's still hard. Um, and it depends. I mean, there's that term which I kind of hate, prompt engineering. I don't like that word. Um, but
Maybe it gives too much credit, but
I think yes, exactly. Um, but yeah, if people really work at it, they can make it output something quite convincing, and other people might read that and think, "Oh, that sounds like a human." But that's different from the sort of exchange that Turing envisions. It would be what, really, what I'm asking is, if you sit me down in front of a terminal and I have a conversation, would I be able to tell that I'm talking to a machine or a human? Um, and yeah, it could depend on a number of things. I think Grant is right. I think it might depend on how long you talk to it for. Um, there was a study recently published which submitted GPT-4 to the Turing test, and it passed in a significant number of interactions. But that was only after 5 minutes of questioning. I think if you look at longer interaction times and compare that with AI expertise or experience with talking to large language models, you would start to see it fail the test more. Um, so, but that's an empirical test, right? This is a conceivability argument. The question is really like, your answer to this conceivability argument is supposed to tell you whether you think verbal behavior is a good indicator of intelligence. And some people are going to say, sure, it is. Yeah. Like Aristotle, um, we are a zoon, hekon, logon. We are an animal with logos, with reason and speech, right? Other animals, they don't have that. Why do we have logos? We have the rational soul. And that's what enables reason and speech, almost like they're two sides of the same coin. But then, there are some animals that are pretty intelligent that don't speak, right? Um, Certain birds have been observed using tools like New Caledonian crows or ravens. They use tools. They don't have speech as we have, although they can learn to imitate human speech. Actually, if you've never seen a raven talk, you should go check that out after class. It's pretty cool. Um, there are humans who are intelligent but nonverbal. Um, so, you know, uh, verbal behavior might be a sufficient component of intelligence, but perhaps not a necessary one, right? And so, using the Turing test as a thought experiment like this, I think kind of lays bare the importance of verbal behavior when it comes to intelligence, or as an indicator of intelligence or thinking, right? Um, you can also think of the Turing test as an empirical test. So, like the example I mentioned, there was a study, and I can actually I'm going to share it in the chat right now in case anybody wants to check it out. But if I go, where did I put it? I must have put it here. I know I bookmarked it. Mm. Oh, I don't know where I put it. Um, okay, well, I guess I'll have to get back to you on this. Um, but take my word for it. There was a study that was recently done, which submits GPT-4 to the Turing test. The Turing test would actually be a good way to find the mark of the mental if we could fine tune it enough. Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you, Grant. Well, I think it might be good for identifying a mark of the mental. I mean, what if there's more than one? I mean, maybe verbal behavior is a good mark of the mental, but there might be others, right? And I think it's good if you want if you're looking for that particular one. But that's not all there is to mentality. But there are different variations of the Turing test. Stephen Harnad's total Turing test, for example, is an embodied version of the test where we don't just look at verbal behavior, but physical appearance and physical behavior. Um, I'll say more about that later. Um, but Turing discusses this test as if it were an empirical test. He says, for example, and remember he's writing in 1950, he says, in about 50 years' time, it will be possible to program computers with a storage capacity of about 10 to the ninth power to make them play the imitation game so well that an average interrogator will not have more than 70% chance of making the right identification after 5 minutes of questioning. Um, so here Turing is talking about using the imitation game as an empirical test of whether some particular machine can think. Like, for example, Elisa, the first chatbot. It is claimed that Elisa was quite convincing. Um, I don't think Elisa would convince any of us now. You can go on the internet and find out. There are little versions of Elisa the chatbot, or Eliza. I say Elisa for some reason. It's Eliza. Anyway, there are versions of Eliza, originally programmed by Joseph Wiesenbaum from MIT back in the 1960s. This was the first chatbot, and it used canned responses. It would kind of rework sentences. And apparently it was quite convincing to Joseph Wiesenbaum's secretary, although I'm not actually convinced that she was all that convinced. Um, so um, if you wanted to submit ELISA to the Turing test, which Wiesenbaum suggested that we'd actually do, that would be an empirical test of a particular machine. For a long time, there was the Lubner Prize competition where um, people would program chatbots and bring them to this competition to see if they could pass the Turing test. And the grand prize gold medal was never won. And apparently, the meetings were described by science journalists as chaotic and disorganized, and they'd almost never be allowed back at the same venue where where the Lubner Prize competition had taken place the year before. So, yeah, not very scientifically rigorous. Again, the paper that I mentioned on ChatGPT and the Turing test, I think if you Google it, you might just be able to find it. Maybe I'll do that because I don't remember where I bookmarked it. So, let's open a new link. ChatGPT. I can't type for Turing test. Da, 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 da. Yeah, Stanford researchers. I'm not finding the actual study. ChatGPT 4 and the Turing test. That might be it. Um, you'll find it if you look. Um, so that's two ways we can use the test as a as a conceivability argument or a thought experiment. And I'd like to note some interesting similarities here between what Turing does in computing machinery and intelligence and what Descartes proposed in the discourses. So we didn't read the discourses, but I have mentioned them. They are quite similar in terms of content to the meditations. Here's what Descartes wrote in the discourse on the method. He said, if there were machines bearing the image of our bodies and capable of imitating our actions so far as it is morally possible, there would still remain two most certain tests whereby to know that they were not therefore really men. Of these, the first is that they could never use words or other signs arranged in such a manner as is competent to us in order to declare our thoughts to others. The second test is that although such machines might execute many things with equal or perhaps greater perfection than any of us, they would, without doubt, fail in certain others, from which it could be discovered that they did not act from knowledge, but solely from the disposition of their organs. So Descartes is saying, like, look, if there were machines that looked and acted like us, we could still tell that they were machines because they couldn't use language to declare their thoughts to others the same way that we can. They would not exhibit the same verbal behavior, in other words, as we can. And also, the second test, even if they are capable of doing things better than we are, certain things like lifting heavy objects or doing calculations very, very quickly, they would still fail in certain other respects where we would know on the basis of that failure that they're not acting from knowledge or reason, but rather sort of mechanically. And I mean, yeah. Uh, have you ever caught a mistake that ChatGPT has made on the basis, and on that basis reasoned that it's not actually thinking? That's one of the ways I discover student work that's been completed by ChatGPT. It makes interesting mistakes, or it explains stuff that I haven't actually taught you. So what's interesting here is that where Turing says if a machine could use words in the way that we do, and we could have a conversation with it, we'd know it was thinking. Descartes says that's the kind of thing a machine could never do. Interesting, don't you think? I'd like to get some discussion going here because really, like, uh, Turing and Descartes are kind of approaching this from two opposite directions. Like again, Turing is saying if you could have a conversation with a machine, you'd know it was intelligent. Descartes says, well, we know that machines aren't intelligent because they could never do that. One thing that I think it's important to note is that Turing is not really as focused on the machinery of the body that Descartes is. Descartes is talking here in the discourses about how our bodies are machine-like, but our minds are not. Right? Remember, our minds are thinking substance. Animals and automata are machines. So if I stub my toe and cry ouch, I really do have the sensation of pain, because I have res cogitans. I'm a thinking thing. Um, if you kick a dog, which you should not do, and it cries out, Descartes would say, well, that's just because of the disposition and arrangement of its organs. It's just like a mechanical process. The dog doesn't really feel pain, right? And this is, of course, what Lemaitre and later T.H. Huxley, they would disagree with Descartes on this issue quite strongly. That's right. They weren't around to see the internet, but um, I wonder what both of them, both Descartes and Turing, would make of large language models. I think Descartes would say would perhaps insist that they still make mistakes that give them away as machines. Whereas Turing would say, well, sure, they're machines, but they're smart. Look, we're able to converse with them, right? Um, but Turing's not really interested in embodied AI, right? He wrote, it is possible that at some time creating a robot indistinguishable from a human might be done. But even supposing this invention available, we should feel there was little point in trying to make a thinking machine more human by dressing it up in such artificial flesh. Instead, what Turing is interested in is our intellectual capacities. So, um, apropos of that, this is an example of the sort of conversation that you might have with a computer in the imitation game. And this is from Turing's paper, right? You might ask it to write a sonnet on the subject of the fourth bridge, and perhaps it would say, count me out on this one. I could never write poetry. I mean, poetry's hard. You could ask ChatGPT to write a poem, and maybe it writes one really great, and you think either, wow, I just happen to be talking to a poet, or I'm talking to a large language model. You could say add 34,957 to 70,764. The computer will pause because if it gives you the answer right away, you'll know it's a computer, right? Descartes would say, "Oh, well, that would give it away instantly. If it answered right away, you'd know it was a computer because what are the chances you're sitting there talking to a savant or a lightning calculator or something? Probably not that great. So, computer." So Turing says in a case like this, you'd have the computer pause to disguise that it's a computer. Maybe you ask if the computer plays chess. Yes. Okay, I have king at king 1, no other pieces. You have king at k6 and rook at r1. What is your move? Computer pauses again to think. R to r8 for checkmate. Again, this is that viva voce style of examination, which we use to see whether somebody really knows what they're talking about or whether they're just kind of rattling off facts that they've learned by rote. Here's where I kind of kick in, kind of come and kick in the door and offer my own perspective on this stuff. Turing doesn't actually define what it means to think. There are a lot of definitions that you could give, but Turing doesn't give any. Um, he uh, he just says like, here's an operationalist test of intelligence as verbal behavior. Okay, cool. Um, but you can kind of read out what he seems to have in mind by thinking. You can kind of read it out of his work. It's the ability to reason domain generally. Uh, with that is the ability to express one's reasoning, one's cognition using language. And finally, the ability to do this in a ostensibly non-deterministic way, or as I put it, to reason originally. And this is quite similar to what Descartes seems to think reason is too. Um, domain general reasoning that can be expressed linguistically and non-deterministically. So Turing machines are determined, right? They're determined by the machine table, the states of the machine, what's on the tape, etc. Um, Turing suggests making them probabilistic, and we'll look at probabilistic. Kim talks about probabilistic Turing machines in this chapter. It's possible that we're probabilistic Turing machines, or that our minds are probabilistic Turing machines. Or maybe we are determined and it just seems to us that we're free. Doesn't matter. We have to reason or appear to reason originally. This is what Turing seems to mean. For the second Turing test, Michael says, when trying to determine if you're talking to a machine, if the machine is adapting to the conversation being had, does that count as thinking on the machine's part? Yeah, I don't know what Turing would say, but I would say yes. Like if the machine was asked, add these two 5-digit numbers together, and then it just instantly gave you the answer, and then you say, "Aha! I have discovered you. You are a computer." Then maybe next time the computer sits down with somebody, it thinks to itself, "Well, I better pause, or it'll think I'm a computer." So it pauses for 30 seconds before giving the answer. I think there are some people who would say, yeah, that sure looks like thinking, that sort of adaptivity. Although some would disagree. We're going to get into John Searle right now, who would say the Turing test is not a good test of intelligence at all. Um, remember, okay, Turing thinks that if the person taking the test, the interrogator, can't tell whether they're interacting with a machine or a human, the test has been passed, and we need to grant that whatever it is doing counts as thinking. John Searle comes along and says, hold on, no, because imagine the following. Imagine this Chinese room scenario. There's a person sitting in a room, isolated from what's outside of the room. And this person is a native English speaker. So she does not speak Chinese. She doesn't read the Chinese characters. Only English. Outside of the room, though, we've got some native Chinese speakers. Could be Mandarin, Cantonese, doesn't matter. They understand the symbols that are written uh, on these little pieces of paper that they pass into the room. So they might write hello in Chinese characters and pass it into the room. Now, let's say the person in the room is somebody like me who doesn't know any Chinese. Um, okay, I'm in there and I get this set of characters that I don't recognize, but I have a rule book and I can look up in my rule book, if you receive this string of characters, reply with this string of characters. So that's what I do. I get this message. I don't know what it says. The people outside of the room know it says hello. So I get it and I look up, if this, reply with this. I write down the characters, pass it out of the room. I don't know what I said. The people outside the room get my piece of paper and see that I've said hello back with a little smiley face, maybe. And then we converse like this in this way. Maybe the people outside of the room write in Chinese characters, do you speak Chinese? We pass that in the room. I get it. I don't know what these characters mean, but I can see in my rule book, if I get this string of characters, I should reply with this string. So I do. What does that string say? I have no idea. The people outside of the room know that it says, yes, I do speak Chinese, but I don't know that it says that. And moreover, I don't speak Chinese at all. And so a whole conversation could go on this way, barring any, time constraints, of course. And that's the Chinese room, right? Um, the book that I have in the room with me is like the program, and it's structured in terms of these if-then statements, like computer programs are. Now, to the people outside of the room, it's going to seem like whoever is in the room understands Chinese. But of course, the person in the room does not understand Chinese at all. Yeah. Maybe whoever wrote the rule book did the thinking. Yeah. And I'm just following it like a computer program. I'm just like iterating through like if this symbol, do this. Right? Until I find the instructions for the set of symbols that I've got. So Searle is going to say the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese at all. No, they're just manipulating inputs and outputs according to rules, which is computation, but Searle doesn't think that computation amounts to understanding or intelligence. What Searle is really trying to show, and Searle is dealing, this is mentioned by Kim, Searle is dealing with examples of computer programs that were available in the late 70s, like Shank's hamburger program, right? Where you'd give a computer a sort of vignette, like a guy goes in, orders a hamburger, and then shortly thereafter storms out of the restaurant. His burger isn't finished. He doesn't leave a tip. Did he enjoy the burger? We know that the answer is no. He probably didn't enjoy the burger, but computers had a hard time with these sorts of problems. So Searle is trying to show that those computers, computer programs at the time, did not have any understanding. They operated only on syntax, not semantics. They operated at the level of like the structure, the relations of the symbols to one another, not what the symbols actually mean. So, so Searle thinks that you can have syntactic symbol manipulation, or if you like, computation, with no intelligence, with no understanding. The semantics in these systems, the meaning of the symbols, is parasitic to the syntax rather than intrinsic to the syntax. We understand meaning, computers don't. And that is what the Chinese room is meant to be an illustration of. And if Searle is right, then the Chinese room is also an objection against the Turing test as a test of intelligence, right? You can see the parallel. The person in the Chinese room does not understand Chinese, even though she seems to be successfully communicating with the native Chinese speakers outside of the room. And the exact same thing we could say of computers, Searle says. They don't understand anything. And if they don't understand anything, how could they be considered intelligent? I say the same thing about ChatGPT when I warn you all not to use it. Not only is it cheating, it doesn't know anything. There's a lot of things I don't like about Searle's work when it comes to this stuff. There's a lot of things I find just kind of icky about the man himself, which I'll let you go read about on your own because I'm not trying to ad hominem anybody here. But I think he is right that the kinds of computer programs that he was talking about in the 70s and 80s did not understand anything. They did not possess understanding. I think it's also correct to say that large language models like ChatGPT don't understand. That's not to say that I don't think that verbal behavior could be a mark of the mental or that computers could be thinking. Actually, I think there might be an important difference between thinking and understanding. See, a lot of this also boils down to what we mean by these words, which is what Turing was trying to sidestep with the Turing test. But I do think he's right in this particular instance and when it comes to large language models. I don't necessarily think it's think it's a good argument against the Turing test because, well, what application of the Turing test are we talking about? Empirical test, conceivability argument, or a reflexive experimental apparatus like what I argued for in my PhD thesis? What use are we talking about? Right? It depends. Okay, chat. Golden Jang says, I think of, sorry, I don't know why I read your whole name. Golden. I think of LLMs as a search engine tool. Information retrieval doesn't mean intelligence. Yeah, I kind of think of them like that as well. I remarked about this during my essay writing instructions. I think they're like a search engine that you can talk to in natural language, which I think is really cool. But is that intelligence? It might be a part of what it is to be intelligent, um, but it certainly can't be the whole picture. But what do you think? What do you guys all think?
Can I offer a hypothetical?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, if you heard like the code word watermelon, watermelon, watermelon 3, what would you think?
I would think three instances of the word watermelon, I guess.
Okay. What if every time you hear that, somebody gets hit?
Like hit, like struck by another person.
Yeah, they get hurt or they get shocked.
Oh, I guess I might associate. Well, I guess I could become conditioned in the behaviorist sense to expect that someone will be struck whenever that phrase is uttered.
So you just made a if you hear watermelon, watermelon, watermelon 3, then expect this. Is that not what a computer does? Especially like certain language models?
Well, uh, well, here's the thing, right? Computers aren't embodied like I am. Like I'm in a dynamic physical environment. And so that's the reason I can form that association and then extract that conditional, right? If watermelon, watermelon, watermelon 3, then somebody's going to get struck. Um, Most computers are not embodied and situated in that sort of environment. And I think this is, you know, part of what Searle is getting at is that, you know, the meaning is intrinsic to uh, our symbols if we think symbolically. We might not. I mean, Searle would disagree with the computational representational theory of the mental, I would think. But if I am a symbol system, my symbols have meaning because they're grounded in the world. And computers don't have that. Computers, we decide what their symbols mean. And I think that's part of what Searle is getting at when he says that their semantics are parasitic to the syntax, right? That's what I would say. Now, yes, there's machine learning, there's robotics, right? Like this could change. This could absolutely change. Um, but at least, looking at the sorts of things that Searle is, yeah, I think there's not really understanding, at least not in the same sense that we've got. Uh, then again, there are some replies to the Chinese room, which we can look at if you guys want to.
Then what about if you are actively looking for a symbol? Like you're actually looking for like for example, Wemyss, for example.
Uh huh.
Whenever you're dealing with any chemical or whatever, you're actually looking for, okay, what are the symbol, what does the symbol mean? What does it mean to be corrosive? Like, oh, I should keep an eye on this,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
If I ask a computer, here's a big text document, look for these string of characters, it does the same. It does not do the same thing.
I'm not sure if it does it in the same way that we do it. Like, it depends on what kind of computer we're talking about. Is it just like searching through like a big long string of letters and looking for patterns that match? That's pretty straightforward.
But
Um,
also, don't they have like things with cameras? Like a camera can.
yeah, they do. They do. We do have machine vision. But um, what I'm doing uh, is a lot more sophisticated than what the computer with a camera is doing. That's not to say that we won't ever get there, right? Like we have facial recognition technology now. Maybe, I mean, maybe those applications are implementing something like what goes on in my fusiform face area, right? Um, but that's just one little part of this big system that is my mind. Um, So, but I'll get to this. Like the human versus a computer doing this is actually in one of the replies that we're going to look at. Okay, where were we? Golden added. I think verbal inputs and outputs aren't rigorous enough to judge intelligence, but I can't think of any other evaluation criteria right now. Yeah, I mean that's part of the problem, right? Is there one and only one mark of the mental, or could there be many? I think maybe we should take a holistic approach, and this is my sort of personal opinion, but what if I mean intentionality is a mark of the mental and certain behaviors, certain verbal behaviors, like what if there are many marks of the mental? Okay. Grant says, could a robot not be embodied and have a camera? Yes, yes, they could. They absolutely could. This is what Stephen Harnad does with the total Turing test. He says, okay, so Searle's right. Like a computer who's in a sort of Chinese room sort of situation, sure, that doesn't have any understanding. But if you had a computational mind in a very sophisticated robot that was not only behaviorally indistinguishable from a human, but physically indistinguishable, like if you looked at it under the microscope and it looked like it had cells and everything, um, you'd have to grant that that's intelligent. Uh, on the basis of behavior, and you could be reasonably certain that it is because the meaning of the symbols, the semantics, is grounded in this sort of embodied interaction with the environment and with other thinking things in the environment. So that's one sort of reply. Doesn't start. Yeah, maybe the person in the Chinese room starts to learn what the symbols mean. Yeah. Um, Well, one thing I'll mention on this slide is that Searle is targeting a specific kind of AI, and that is symbolic AI. The same kind of picture of AI we get with the Turing machine. So that's classical AI, right? Where we have like these if-then rules, condition action statements. Symbols are physical patterns that represent information, and we can transform strings of symbols into other strings of symbols by following the rules and blah, 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 right? Searle is not talking about parallel distributed processing or neural networks. Um, we're not talking about machine learning. We're not talking about robotics. He's talking about a specific kind of artificial intelligence, right? Um, that's all I'll say here. There were a couple of good replies to Searle's Chinese room scenario in in the behavioral and brain sciences. It's a really interesting journal because you get the paper and then you get commentary to the paper when it's published, and a couple of these replies appear in the commentary, and one is the systems reply. We could say that maybe the person in the room doesn't understand Chinese, but she is at least behaving intelligently insofar that she's matching the symbols, looking up the rules in the book, etc. So we could understand understanding or analyze understanding Chinese in terms of more basic forms of understanding. So there are like maybe minds are such that you know the intelligence emerges, and fundamentally what you have are just a lot of like dumb processes going on that, when all working in concert, as we go up the hierarchy, the system is intelligent. Um, So maybe Searle's looking in the wrong place, right? Maybe if the person doesn't understand Chinese, that's fine. But the whole system, the room, the book, the inputs and outputs, and the person, the whole system understands Chinese. What do you think? Yeah, yeah, like Grant says, a distributed cognitive system is still a cognitive system. It's like Leibniz's mill, right? If you shrink yourself down and look around in the brain, you'll just see neurons firing. If you walk around in the Chinese room, you'll just see, oh, here's a book, here's a person matching strings of symbols with, inputs and outputs. Maybe you need to take a step back and look at the whole system. The whole system is what's intelligent. The whole system is what is doing the understanding, not any particular part of it. Or there's the robot reply, which is similar to Harnad's total Turing test. Um, so the room doesn't understand Chinese, but maybe for different reasons than Searle states. Maybe the reason the person in the room or even the entire system doesn't understand Chinese is because it's not an embodied agent um, in a dynamic physical environment, right? After all, interacting Chinese involves interacting with other Chinese speakers in a Chinese speaking society, right? It's like Wittgenstein's beat. Remember, we talked about the mental theater and the beetle in the box and what grounds the meaning of our word pain and et cetera, et cetera. Wittgenstein would say we're all playing the same language game, right? Maybe what we need to do is shrink our Chinese room down and put it in a robot, and then put that robot, send it to China, and have it interact with lots of native speakers, have it do things that people do in China. Go to the store. You've got to ask, like, hey, I'm looking for a new frying pan. I don't know, like, but you got to do it in Chinese. And so you learn, like, oh, this is how you say frying pan, right? Um, you're interacting with other thinking agents that speak Chinese, communicate in Chinese, in an environment where everybody's doing the same thing. And so if you put the Chinese room in this robot with the right kinds of sensors and effectors and put it in the right kind of environment with other similar agents, it maybe an understanding of Chinese would emerge, right? I think Cyril would still claim that such a robot would not understand uh, because it remains a physical simple system. But I leave it to you to decide whether you're sympathetic to one or both of these replies, or maybe to some of Harnad's ideas, um, or whether you're sympathetic to Turing. Golden says, I'd also say you don't need to have a perfect understanding to be intelligent. You can talk with someone who doesn't speak your language and they can still appear intelligent. Yeah, that's true. Like, oh, that reminds me of this time, like, I was fishing on the Rideau Canal, and there was this older fella there who was fishing, um, and he didn't speak any English. And so I'm like, did you? I say to him, "Hey, catch anything today?" And he says, he kind of does like this, like, hmm. And then I say, "Oh, catch anything?" Yeah, and he goes, "Oh, no," like this. And I could understand, oh, so he hasn't caught any fish today because even though we didn't speak the same language, we've kind of figured it out, right? Yeah, there's nonverbal communication, yeah. Although it's not exactly universal. I mean, in some cultures, thumbs up is good. In some cultures, giving a thumbs up means like cram it, you know, where the sun don't shine. So, but there are like some uh, pretty universal nonverbal behaviors. Facial expressions are pretty universal. At least there are like six. There are at least six that are like pretty universally recognized, like anger, sadness, joy, disgust, surprise, and neutral. I think are all pretty universal. Um, and again, that's like maybe by virtue of the way that we're embodied. We can do certain things with our faces and we feel certain ways when we do them. And so we come to understand, like, this is happy, this is angry. Oh, I forgot fear. Fear is one. Your eyes are like, oh. Disgust. I mean, everybody knows when someone's disgusted, you get that, right? This could all be, maybe this is universal because of the way that we're embodied. Um, that's really all I have for today. Um, Next time on Wednesday, we'll look at causal theoretical functionalism. We'll look at chapter 6, which is, I believe, it's shorter than this chapter was. I can't remember. I haven't reread it yet. But if you got all the way through Kim's chapter, good for you, because that was a long one. And I know I didn't stick very close to it, but I like to think that I hit the main points, right? Turing machines, the Turing test, functionalism, Searle's replies, the Chinese room, the replies to the Chinese room, etc. I do think we covered everything. Um, I always worry I'm not explaining things well enough, and that maybe you're too shy to ask me questions. So, is there anything that you're unclear about? Have I explained? Do you feel like you understand Turing machines and the Turing test and Chinese rooms and functionalism? Do you feel like you've got the gist of it, or do you want to use the rest of the time that we've got to kind of hash it out a little bit further? Well, I guess not, because people have started leaving.
I, I was thinking
Oh,
maybe we could like use the time to look at the essay proposal that's due in a few days. Or like,
yeah, okay, we could do that. We could do that. Before we do, I think Golden had another question.
oh yeah, yeah, of course.
The main problem right now is that I'm not sure what the definition of intelligence is. That's why we're here. Yeah, like, what is intelligence? Turing thought, like, can a machine think? What is thinking? What is a machine? What is intelligence? Am I a machine? Is thinking the use of reason, the use of language? Is it problem solving? Is it the ability to use tools? Is it something that intentional systems do? We could spend, and philosophers have spent, years and years and years trying to get to the bottom of it. So Turing sidesteps that question, right?
I have a question.
Adrian, yeah,
Like
go
to
ahead.
go on that. For so not the Turing machine, but the machine he made, the combat enigma. What's it called? The Bombay, whatever.
The bomb.
The bomb. Can
Hmm.
that think?
Um, if, well, again, if you buy into the computational representational theory of mind that says that thinking just is computation, then yes, it did. But I would say the way that it did it was probably a lot different from the way that we did it. See, we're doing philosophy, right? So you've got to remember that the questions that we're dealing with are not going to necessarily have like an empirical, like an answer that you can arrive at empirically. Some of it is definitional or conceptual. So like, do machines think? Depends what you think thinking is, or what intelligence is, or what a machine is. I say yes, they do. I think I am a thinking machine. I am a natural biological machine with a brain and a nervous system and a body which enables me to think. Um, Others, like John Searle, would disagree with that. They would say, no, 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 that's not. You're thinking, but the machine isn't thinking, and you are not a machine. Searle's position is actually called biological naturalism, and he thinks that intelligence and consciousness are things that biological organisms have, and that machines do not have. So it depends what you mean, right? And to try to work out what we mean by thinking, by intelligence, by machine, etc., we can use the Turing test as a thought experiment. We can do the Chinese room thought experiment and try to get clearer about what we understand these terms to mean, how we conceptualize machines, thinking, intelligence, etc. Um, make sense?
Yeah. Okay. So by that logic, would something like the Library of Babel be thinking?
Oh, the Library of Babel. What,
Here,
like,
I'll post a link in chat.
oh,
It's a website where the entire concept is imagine you don't think the thought experiment of a million monkey or infinite monkeys randomly typing will eventually do Shakespeare.
yes.
It's basically that, but you give the computer the answer and it finds you the question that gives you the answer. That's not just like the bomb.
Oh,
All right.
it reminds me of Jeopardy, how the questions are answers and your answers have to be in the form of a question.
Well, not necessarily.
Yeah.
I give you the answer. Like for example, they know that the Turing test will have, or the cipher will have a word like, well, I think in the movie it said like "Hail Hitler," but in
Yeah.
real life it was like weather. Okay, so that's the answer to the question. Give me the parameters that would lead me to that answer,
Yeah.
right?
I think the computationalists would regard that as a kind of thinking.
Because that's what this website, like for example, that's how Bitcoin mining works,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
I would say if you're a computationalist, yes.
Okay.
But not everyone is.
Oh, all right then.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Like
like
Searle is not a computationalist or a functionalist. Turing and Putnam would say, "Oh, that sounds a lot like thinking." Um, or at least it's computation. If thinking is computation, then yeah, that's thinking. Um, but others like Searle would say, no, that's not thinking at all. Thinking is something that biological creatures do, right? Um, Timothy.
Uh, I think there was some argument that to like think in the same way humans do, you have to have consciousness and self-awareness. I think it was that.
Um,
Right?
yeah, well,
And some you can
so
yeah, sorry. Yeah,
I just wanted to interject and say that I think that thinking and consciousness are different things.
yeah,
Yeah.
those two things. And uh I guess like consciousness is a way people used to infer thinking or something like that. I think like
Well, I think that we might be conscious of some of the things that we think about. Like
right.
if you're like really trying to reason your way through a problem, like if you're doing a thought experiment or
Mhm.
solving a math question,
Right.
you're probably like, especially if it's something unfamiliar. Like if you'd never heard of the Chinese room before, and I
You're
ask
gonna
you to
try to
think about
imagine
it,
something, but
yeah,
maybe
you're
you
like,
won't be correct.
yeah, so you're like imagining and you're like very slowly and deliberatively working your way through the problem,
Uh,
then consciousness is playing a role there. But if you're like an expert, um, let's say you're like an expert of some kind, like you're a pro hockey player,
mhm.
and the puck comes and you do a slap shot and you get it in the net.
That
How
might have been
much?
subconscious.
How were you? How conscious were you? Probably not very conscious,
Yeah,
right?
I remembered in one of the lectures when you were arguing against using AI. You said it doesn't actually know what things are or whatever.
I guess it doesn't know. What I mean is it doesn't know in that like sort of conscious deliberative
Right.
way that we know.
I don't disagree, but
Yeah.
do you think it's possible that something like or like we could make something artificial that does know? Like
Oh,
could
certainly. Yeah, yeah.
we could say something super advanced AI?
Yeah. And
Or-
then like I haven't even gotten into Dennett like where like like this is like a whole rabbit hole I could go down
Right.
like
Yeah.
the whole rest of the night.
Too much.
Yes, like I think in principle we can make thinking machines. I absolutely do think that.
Mhm.
Can we make a conscious machine? I don't know. Um, Consciousness is different than thinking,
Right.
and we have no idea. Like if you ask, like, hey, how do we explain human subjective consciousness? We have no freaking idea, right? So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm like, machines can totally think. Could a machine be conscious? That's where we start kind of maybe having to look at like Dennett, and we're going to when we read Quining Qualia. Um, So those questions we'll save for the end of the course. But yeah, like I'm pretty happy as a computationalist. I think that thinking is uh
Multiple realizable or something like that.
yeah, I think cognitive systems are multiply realizable, and I do think cognition is information processing. Um, where I start to run out of answers, I guess, is where subjective consciousness comes in. But like, welcome to the club, right? Like I remember I sat down, I had a meeting with Professor Andrew Brook of Carleton. I was talking with him. This is when I was still in grad school,
Mhm.
and I was thinking of stuff to study and kind of continue to hone ways of honing my skills and continuing to learn as I went through graduate school. Um, and Andy is like the goat. Like he's been at the department a long time. He founded the Department of Cognitive Science. He knows or knew like all the big names in philosophy of mind and all of that. And he knows quite a bit about consciousness, and that's one of his main areas of interest. And I say to him, I said, "Hey, Professor Brook, like I'd really like to study consciousness, but I just have no idea where to begin." And he looks at me and just kind of chuckles, like as if to say, like, "Yeah, man, welcome to the club." Like, yeah, consciousness is mysterious. But it's mysterious in that way that Dennett talks about, where, for Dennett, a mystery is something we don't yet know how to think about. And I still feel that way after all this time. Like, I feel like when it comes to thinking, I know how to think about thinking. I still don't know if I know how to think about consciousness.
Maybe that's what makes it fun to think about.
And
Yeah.
it's exactly what makes it fun to think about. So, and that's why we're going to end with some Thomas Nagel and with some Dennett. Um, Okay,
Yeah.
so do we want to talk about any questions about the proposal that's due?
Okay, I do have one quick question about the proposal. Yeah,
Okay, go
sorry if
ahead.
anyone else is going to ask. Like, um, is it the sort of thing where it doesn't have to be like very well structured? Like maybe we can, it's just like writing out ideas, or is it
Well,
an essay? Like,
I'd like it. I'd like it to have the structure that I outline in the template and in my
right?
instructions.
Yeah,
So
yeah, the area of interest, thesis,
yeah,
plan of
I
attack.
want
But
like 200 to 250 word area of interest where you're like, here's what I want to talk about. Here's some information about it to give you the context. Here's why I want to talk about it, et cetera, right?
right,
Then I want a research question and an answer or a thesis statement. And then 200 to 250 word plan of attack where you say, like, um, will it be a negative, a positive, adjudicative paper? What sources have I got so far? How I'll use them? What sources will I have I yet to identify? How do I think I'll use those?
mhm,
Maybe sketch out your argument or something like that, right? And then,
right.
of course, your references. So I wanted to at least have that structure. Yeah.
Mhm.
And
But
don't
the
forget your drafts.
right, two drafts, I believe it
Two
was.
drafts, two early drafts plus the final draft for a total of three. Yeah.
For the assignment one, like I did two early drafts, of course, but
Yeah.
I just submitted them all at the same time. Like, I
Yeah.
don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. That's fine.
That's
Yeah.
fine. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the thesis, you said it's just one or two sentences, right?
Yeah. Like one or two
That's just
sentences that tells the reader what you're
what
going
we're
to
doing.
argue.
What's
Like,
happening.
what are you going to try and convince me of? Right?
Right.
Are you going to try and convince me that machines can think or that they can't think? Then say, in this essay, I will argue that machines cannot think or that they can think. Right?
Mhm.
Is the proposal about any material from the whole course? Well, if you want, like, I'd like you to write on a topic that, I mean, that's really like the one of the big rules is I want you to write on a topic that has something to do with the mental. It doesn't have to be something that we've covered specifically. For example, right, we don't really talk about robotics, so you could do something with robotics. Uh, oh, on topics we have yet to cover. Oh, yeah, yeah, totally. Like if you want to read ahead and do something on mental causation and relate that to like free will or the debate
Oh, oh,
around epiphenomenalism, yeah, you can absolutely do that.
You will determine.
Let's see. Grant says, I've been thinking of a proposal for weeks now, and the problem I'm having is it's probably a PhD level thesis. I'm struggling to condense this metaphysical idea to fill of mind. How does this sound? Any mark or marks of the mental presuppose temporal structure. However, time itself is not a mark of the mental because it is not exclusive to minds. Grant, read Kant. Yes, if you want to do something with this, read Kant. For Kant, space and time are like forms of sensible intuition. They are empirically real, like space and time are out there, but space and time are also transcendentally ideal in that they are prior to perception and cognition in the mind. They are how the mind organizes our experience of the world. So check out some Kant. Einstein, Albert Einstein of relativity fame, was not just a good physicist and not just a good mathematician. He read Kant. He read Spinoza. He read the guys that we read in philosophy classes. And Kant was also something of an astronomer. Kant was the first person to propose that nebulae, what we called all big blotchy patches of light in the sky, not just nebula nowadays, but also like if you see the Andromeda galaxy out with your telescope at night, that would have been called a nebulae. Kant was the first person to propose that those might be island universes or what we now call galaxies. So uh, I would start, maybe don't go right for Kant, but read about Kant. Read about his transcendental idealism. I think that will give you some inspiration, Grant. Timothy, go ahead.
I hope your grading criteria isn't about how complicated isn't
No, no, no.
how complicated our topic is, because
No, 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 no. It's
yeah,
not.
like not really on the level of philosophers like Grant here.
It's fine. It's fine.
But
I want to see how well you execute what you've
right,
decided to
like
do.
the logical reasoning,
Yeah.
hopefully meaning obviously meaning the word limit, the structure and stuff. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of it's about execution,
this
not
is like my
about like,
second philosophy course, real deep. Like,
well, like, look, you just you don't have to write like some paradigm shiftingly amazing paper. I just want you
right,
to write a good paper,
right.
right? Yeah.
Like the first paper, I'm pretty sure I made made a common argument, drew an example from a fiction, and then reached a conclusion.
Yeah, yeah, no, no. I That's okay. I'm allowing people to do that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
So don't stress about that too much.
All
Okay,
right.
Grant also adds, I'm a physicist and I've done an entire class on general and special relativity, so two classes, and I understand time in a physics way too much, but in a mental way, I've seen that we can't have any mental processes or a mental at all if we don't have time. Yeah, yeah. Sounds like you've got it. Um, or if you want to even, you can read Kant, but you can also, I mean, neurologically, we've identified like place cells in the hippocampus that fire uh, in such a way that they represent our immediate environment. We call them place cells.
I
Um,
guess wouldn't processes imply that time is passing, or like there's some sort of thing
yes, yes.
happening,
Well, like I said, for Kant,
unless yeah, unless you're omniscient or something. I don't know.
well, Kant Kant does not say that time is all in your head. Time, there are
Yeah,
events that happen
that
in the
would
world,
allow processes.
but we
Sure.
understand what goes on in the world causally because space and time are forms of intuition.
Oh.
Yeah. So they are empirically real, but they're also transcendentally ideal. Um, yeah, if anyone's interested in this, I would read about Kant's transcendental idealism, and then if you want, read some of the critique of pure reason, and you'll get the picture. Yeah. But yeah, like how could we have mental processes or a mental at all without time? Exactly. Like uh, Kant's whole reason for doing this is because he's responding to David Hume, who says that we have no rational basis for inferring causality. It's just a sort of like a custom or a habit that we have. But there's no actual rational basis for doing it. And Kant is like, well, we can't have that if we're going to do science. So he has to fix everything. So that's what Kant does. He comes along and tries to save science from Hume's skepticism. He said that David Hume awakened him from his dogmatic slumber. So, yeah, gotta read Kant. Kant is huge. Like Kant is up there with like Plato and Aristotle in terms of his importance in philosophy. Absolutely huge. Um,
I guess
okay,
is Kant sort of just like simplifying things? Like we can just
no,
understand the world as we see it.
no,
Or
no. Kant is. I can't
yeah,
really.
too complicated.
You've got to read it.
All right.
What he's doing, he called it a Copernican revolution in metaphysics. Like, so where
Oh,
Copernicus was like, instead of trying to make everything conform to a geocentric solar system, we move it to a heliocentric one. Maybe we can make instead of we'll have our Copernican revolution in metaphysics where instead of making the objects conform to our cognition, objects in the world, we make cognition conform to the
conform to the world.
objects. So that's all I'll say. Otherwise, I'll never shut up. Um, but yeah, just check out some Kant if you like. Uh, are there any other questions before we wrap up? The main thing, I know I just went on a big old Kant digression, blah, 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 Kant this, Kant that, but functionalism, Turing machines, the Turing test, Chinese room, we're good on these four things. I mean, we will revisit some of it on Wednesday because it's also about a type of functionalism. And we will be sticking closer to the textbook. But yeah, I guess if there are no other questions about anything, we can probably wrap it up. So thanks, everybody. This was fun. Got to change it up a little bit and kind of get outside of the textbook, although I hope you still read the textbook um, or read this chapter. And I'll see you all on Wednesday. So
Yeah.
bye for now.
See you Wednesday, where I've hopefully finished the proposal.
Yeah, I'm sure you'll be fine.
I finished the first assignment on time, so that's good. All right.
Excellent. Okay.
See
Well,
you
we'll
on
see.
Wednesday.
We'll see you Wednesday. And yes, somebody wants to talk to me after. So here, we'll just stop recording. I'll see you all on Wednesday.